So I am trying to give in this paper a sense of some of the intentions that inform the project for which Antipodean in China is the first event, and also trialing some ways of conceiving of literary relations in the spirit, I believe, of this project and of Antipodean in China. I think it bears remembering that there is not a purpose to our coming together in the way that an academic event with its brief of contributing to knowledge has a certain kind of purpose. I enjoyed John Minford's opening yesterday, partly because he was struggling to work out why he was here. And I think the struggling to work out why we are here is our point, and often it can be difficult not to follow the grooves of already producing knowledge before it has happened. So I think that, as Nick said to me the day before this event, we're looking for peripheral and fleeting connections, and that's actually something that's very hard to achieve. Other Worlds, this is the general title of the project for which Antipodean China is the first major gathering. It begs the question, which is the world from which these other worlds are to be distinguished? One answer is straightforward. Other world to that world that has been brought into being by globalization. This is a literary project, so there is another implicit claim. We are interested in literary worlds other than those that either have been conscripted into or nurtured by globalization. Over the last 20 years, the area of research that has focused on literature and globalization has come to be called world literature. So a gloss of our title might be Literary Worlds Other Than World Literature. The project also carries the subtitle Forms of World Literature. Does this already present a contradiction? That having announced that we're interested in worlds other than the literature of globalization, we then go on to indicate that our specific focus is to be the forms produced by that very thing. I think there is a contradiction, and it's a tension between literary form and world literature. To announce an intention to focus on literary form is already to break with the tendency of the field of discourse around world literature. This is a field that has largely been concerned with externalities, the systems and processes by which literary objects move around the world, and also, and this is very important, polemics against empirical approaches. So if what we're doing is polemicizing against a certain version of world literature, we're already participating in world literary discourse. So we need to be wary of the traps of iconoclasm. To focus on literary form takes us away from world literature and into the world literary forms create. So the phrase forms of world literature might be understood in another way. It could be taken to suggest that world literature can take various forms, and so our purpose is to study these forms, a kind of morphology of different conceptions of world literature. I want to suggest that these two aspects of the subtitle of two possible readings can be linked. Indeed, both senses have a common intention. To think about literary form and the connections between practices of creating literary forms in different places around the globe brings into view alternative ways in which world literature might be perceived and understood. Other worlds, other ways of thinking of world literature become visible when we attend to those worlds that literary form making brings into being. This explains why the group that has come together for this project largely consists of practicing writers. Rather than considering how the work of writers circulate and are interpreted after the fact, we take the practice of creating literary forms as itself the practice of world making, one that has the power to change how we are oriented to the world, and so to reorient those worldly projects on which we find ourselves already embarked. So in the rest of this short paper, I want to outline a concept that I believe can give us a way of conceiving of a form of world literature that arises from attending to literary form. The concept is literary meridian. I adapt the concept from the French-German or German-French, or otherwise conceived poet Paul Celan's well-known speech, Der Meridian, which he delivered on the occasion of being awarded the Buchner Prize in 1960. This speech is written in a way that is unparaphrasable, though many have provided glosses. This alone attests to its allure as a statement about poetry and poetic experience. So to be clear, the following comments are simply what I take from this speech, not any underlying discursive meaning that I believe I've rescued from its delicately pitched obscurity. The figure of a meridian is something that Celan comes to right at the end. He states that he finds, quote, the connective, which, like the poem, leads to encounters. I find something as immaterial as language, yet earthly, terrestrial, in the shape of a circle which, via both poles, rejoins itself and on the way serenely crosses even the tropics. I find a meridian. The notion of the meridian gives Celan a way of bringing into some kind of alignment the place of departure and the point of arrival for poetic experience. Entering poetry, he states earlier, is a movement beyond what is human, into a realm that is nevertheless turned back toward the human. He asked repeatedly how he can locate this realm which speaks on behalf of the strange, on behalf of the other. This is also a region from which literary characters hail. To get to this region, one may undertake, as he says, topological research, suggesting at once the study of tropes and topography. But the source of light comes from the place which one hopes to discover. That's kind of key here. The source of the light comes from the place that one hopes to discover, so you're being guided by a light that does not, in a sense, emanate onto the object. Celan appears to be trying to convey to us what is possible when we pass into the world which poems make possible, but this cannot be articulated using the words we use to describe what happens in our normal human realm. It seems important to Celan that the meridian is neither given over to the ideal world of the poem, and he talks about what that might be, nor to the material world of reality. It is, quote, immaterial yet earthly. Saying the word meridian cannot but call up an image of an imaginary arc passing around the earth, objectively aligning all those places that simultaneously experience a particular position of the sun. Meridian, we must remember, comes from the Latin for midday or noon. For Celan, though, the meridian is the light shed by the poem, a, quote, utopian light. The arc must therefore run through points that the poem itself simultaneously connects. We must keep in mind that the meridian runs between the imaginary and the real as well, so we should not just think about the poem alone, between our disposition to the poem and the way the poem's world affects us. So the key point about literary meridians is that literary works themselves constitute and produce relations, or as Celan puts it, encounters. And this is one way of conceiving what we've set ourselves to do with this project, to explore the literary meridians created by the work of the writers who are involved. This also involves considering how these literary relations start to reshape worldly affiliations and projects, such as with the South. Not just that the South is a literary meridian, it's also that in the case of John Coetzee, it's reshaping projects and how people relate. These meridians could hardly be mapped onto each other, but thinking about them together might help us to understand what the literary imagination puts together in the face of globalization. And as Sam brought to our attention in her introduction, there's been a lot of language to try and describe the kinds of connections between things, resonances, living spiritual world, or spiritually living world, actually, I think it was, Alexis. And I've had my ear open to things that might come under the rubric of a literary meridian throughout the workshop yesterday. And I can't say I came up with anything that entirely fits with the idea, so, which is a good thing, right? Like I brought a concept and it didn't necessarily work. Nevertheless, there are a couple of things that resonated. One was in Alexis's talk at the beginning of the day, talked about rewriting ourselves out of a devastating history, rewriting Aboriginal people. And she said this involves recovering an Aboriginal cosmopolitanism. And this brought her to think about her own family connection to China and the whole history of the Chinese presence in Aboriginal Australia. She also talked about a connection with A Lai, the writer that she encountered in Guangzhou earlier in the year. I'm right, you did encounter him directly. And she said, well, the thing that she saw in A Lai was not an aesthetic affinity so much as an exigency, a need to recreate the world in which she and A Lai existed first through literature, rather than necessarily rush to connect things. So I think that's something that we might call a literary meridian, an alignment of two projects of reconstructing worlds, which is very different from the kinds of network theory that tend to go in world literature, where it says a woman from Australia meets a man from China and they share lots of things, and isn't it great that they're connected? Another moment is just in the discussion with Gail Jones and John Coetzee, where Gail spoke of being inspired by the paratactical aspects of Chinese ideograms as a way of thinking about parataxis in prose fiction. And John followed up by saying, yes, it's about a positive relation rather than a conjunctive relation. Again, that's sort of trying to go to some deep sense of the forms and how they might relate. This has a history in European modernism, but it also has a moment, it seems, in Australia at the moment. And we shouldn't just say, well, this fits with a tradition that's already established in European aesthetics of turning to the Chinese ideogram in a kind of paratactical spirit. And I also think when John Minford talked about the universal heart and mind, which came up in Sam's collage, that there's something like an aspiration for the universal heart and mind that if you say it already starts to sound sentimental, but there's a kind of desire to achieve universality that brings people into the desire to align themselves. The thing I want to end with, if I have time, is just to talk about the South, because we're doing two things in this workshop. We're talking about Antipodes in China, and we're also talking about the idea of the South, and we had the session last night. John Coetzee, in his prefatory remarks, quoted from the lecture that he gave in Buenos Aires last year, and I'll just reread these comments, that what will be left, will be the real South, the South of this real world, where most of us present here today were born and most of us will die. It is a unique world. There is only one South, with its unique skies and its unique heavenly constellation. So this doesn't sound like a literary meridian. It sounds like a latitudinal meridian. People living in South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Chile, and Argentina all share settler colonial histories. They also share a certain alignment in relation to the Earth poles and to the cosmos. Does this tend to suggest that common historical and geographical coordinates will mean that the literatures of the South also have something in common? That in a sense literature follows history and that literature follows geography? And I do wonder, listening to the discussion last night, if the reverse might not be the case, that locating an alignment of the literatures of the South tells us something about current common experiences of geography and history. A literary meridian of the South that orients us to the history that we share in order that we have a deeper sense of what those histories and geographies have done. Reading across, as I was invited to do earlier in the year, Coetzee's corpus in the light of this idea, I think there's a way in which we can perceive such a literary meridian of the South that has, in a sense, preceded any latitudinal meridian. Toward the end of In the Heart of the Country, which of course we heard from last night, Magda, the protagonist, starts forming giant messages with stones. These are addressed to the sky gods. The first is to have been Poemus Crepuscularius, though she runs out of stones and it becomes Poemus Crepusculus. This is followed by other messages like Somnos de Libertad and Amor sin Terra, dreams of liberty and love without terror. Now, the Chilean poet Pablo Neruda's first published collection was titled Crepusculario, Crepuscular Poems, poems reaching across a meridian at twilight. In this section, Magda exclaimed to herself, "The medium, the median, that is what I wanted to be, neither master nor slave, neither parent nor child, but the bridge between, so that in me the contraries should be reconciled." One of the Sydney-based writer Senor C's short essays in Diary of a Bad Year is on Zeno's paradox. After going over two ways in which counting is conceived, as discovery or invention, Senor C comes to Borges's fable, Funes the Memorious, in which the character of the title has created a sequence in which numbers are replaced by other things, sulphur, the rains, the whale, gas, the cauldron, Napoleon, and so on. Incidentally, the story carries the following passage. Quote, this is the Borges, he was the solitary and lucid spectator of a multiform, instantaneous, and almost intolerably precise world. Babylon, London, and New York have overwhelmed, with their ferocious splendor, the imaginations of men. No one, in their populous towers or their urgent avenues, has felt the heat and pressure of a reality as indefatigable as that which day and night converged upon the hapless Ireneo in his poor South American suburb. And what person living in the South does not think about what a poor suburb might be? In the meantime, and going back to Diary of a Bad Year, Senor C's typist boyfriend, Alan, concocts a scheme to filch money from Senor C's bank account in order to make its numbers multiply upward endlessly on the stock market. The School Days of Jesus is set in a town called Estrella, bringing Kutsaya's work and Shane Warne's cricket commentary into as close alignment as they are ever likely to come. The Spanish word Estrella means stars. In this novel set in a land where all are arrivants, the boy David enters the Academy of Dance. He has always either resisted or been unable to follow the process of counting as pure sequencing n+1. At the Academy, he learns to dance down the numbers when numbers are palpable things. By the novel's conclusion, Senor C has stopped insisting that the boy conform to an education centered on math as sequence, and himself starts to learn to dance. So these cues for a literary meridian of the South are intertextual, but I don't want to suggest that this is a concept that is about intertextuality. The question is how these alignments orient us towards the South. What these moments in these three novels do not share in any obvious way is the, quote, real experience of a particular latitudinal coordinate. They cue different ways of appealing to the literary imagination against worlds formed by brutality and the indifferent calculi of finance and dogmatic reasons, of kinds that are strangely detached from any historical self-awareness. And in concluding, I just want to say that if this is a literary meridian of the South, if these kinds of alignments are the things that we're searching for, we should also be thinking about the worldly. That John Coetzee last night talked about his work with Ivor Indyk to have Australian translate Argentinian works directly. So literary projects get reshaped by literary meridians, and so the ideal and real worlds are brought into some kind of connection. Thank you very much.